Welcome to the captivating story of Esther, a tale of courage, faith, and divine providence that has inspired generations. The book of Esther, found in the Old Testament, stands unique among biblical texts for several reasons. Unlike other books in the Bible, Esther never directly mentions God, yet his presence is felt throughout the narrative in the way events unfold. This book tells the story of a young Jewish woman who becomes queen of Persia and saves her people from destruction. The events of Esther take place in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, during the reign of King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus in Hebrew. This places our story around 486 to 465 BCE, at the height of the Persian Empire's power and influence. At this time, the Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from India to Ethiopia. It was a multicultural realm, home to diverse peoples, including a significant Jewish population living in exile after the fall of Jerusalem. King Xerxes, son of Darius the Great, ruled over this vast empire. Known for his ambitious military campaigns and lavish displays of wealth, Xerxes provides the backdrop against which our story unfolds. It's in this setting of power, opulence, and political intrigue that we meet Esther, a young Jewish woman about to embark on an extraordinary journey that will change the course of history for her people. As we delve into this remarkable story, prepare to witness how ordinary individuals can rise to face extraordinary challenges and how faith can guide us through our darkest hours. Our story begins with a lavish display of power and wealth. King Xerxes, at the height of his reign, decides to throw an extravagant feast in his capital, Susa. This wasn't just any celebration. For 180 days, the king showcased the riches of his kingdom and the splendor of his majesty. Imagine the finest silks, the most exquisite foods, and rivers of wine flowing through the palace. As if that wasn't enough, Xerxes then hosted a 7-day banquet for all the people in the citadel of Susa, from the least to the greatest. The palace gardens were adorned with white and blue linen hangings, fastened with purple cords to silver rings on marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine flowed freely, served in gold goblets of various kinds. The king's command was that each guest should be served whatever he wished. Meanwhile, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded his 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before him. She was to wear her royal crown to display her beauty to the people and nobles. But then, the unthinkable happened. Queen Vashti refused to come. In a society where the king's word was absolute law, Vashti's refusal was nothing short of scandalous. The king was furious, his anger burning within him. Immediately, Xerxes consulted his wise men, who understood the laws and customs of the time. Their verdict was swift and harsh. They argued that Vashti's disobedience wasn't just an insult to the king, but a threat to the entire patriarchal order of the empire. One advisor, Memucan, declared, "Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen in the empire. For this queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, 'King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come.'" The king and his nobles agreed. A decree was issued, never to be repealed, that Queen Vashti was banished from the royal presence forever. Furthermore, the decree stated that every man should be ruler over his own household. And so, with a stroke of the royal signet ring, Vashti vanished from the halls of power, leaving behind a vacant throne and setting the stage for the rise of an unlikely heroine. With Queen Vashti banished, the halls of the palace fell quiet, but not for long. As King Xerxes' anger subsided, he found himself in need of a new queen. The king's personal attendants proposed a solution. "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa." And so began an empire-wide search for a new queen, setting our story in motion. It's here that we meet our hero, or rather heroine, Esther. But to understand Esther, we must first meet Mordecai. Mordecai was a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, whose family had been exiled from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had raised as his own daughter when her parents died. Hadassah was known by her Persian name, Esther. The text tells us that Esther was lovely in form and features. But as we'll soon see, her beauty was more than skin deep. When the king's order for the queen's search was proclaimed, Esther was taken to the palace and placed in the care of Haggai, who was in charge of the harem. Now, becoming queen wasn't as simple as showing up at the palace. The young women underwent 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. It was during this time that Esther's true character began to shine. Esther won the favor of Haggai, who provided her with beauty treatments and special food, 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace, and moved her to the best place in the harem. Following Mordecai's instructions, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background. Finally, after a year of preparation, it was Esther's turn to go to the king. She asked for nothing other than what Haggai suggested, and she won the favor of everyone who saw her. Esther was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. But even as Esther adjusted to her new role as queen, Mordecai remained watchful. He sat at the king's gate daily, keeping an eye on Esther and the happenings of the palace. It was during one of these times that Mordecai overheard something alarming. 2 of the king's officers, Bigthana and Teresh, who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Mordecai reported this to Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. When the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. Little did anyone know how crucial this seemingly small act of loyalty would prove to be. As Esther settled into her role as queen, a new player entered the scene. King Xerxes decided to promote a man named Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him above all the other nobles. Haman was now second in rank only to the king himself. With this newfound power came a command from Xerxes. All the royal officials at the king's gate were to bow down and pay honor to Haman. And so they did. All that is, except one man, Mordecai. Day after day, the other officials questioned Mordecai. "Why do you disobey the king's command?" they asked. But Mordecai stood firm. He had told them he was a Jew, and his faith forbade him from bowing to anyone but God. When Haman noticed Mordecai's defiance, he was enraged. But for Haman, punishing Mordecai alone wasn't enough. Upon learning that Mordecai was Jewish, Haman's anger twisted into something far more sinister. Haman devised a plan not just to eliminate Mordecai, but to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the 1st month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. The lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. With the date set, Haman approached King Xerxes. His words were carefully chosen, designed to manipulate. "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them." Without asking who these people were or investigating Haman's claims, Xerxes agreed. He took his signet ring from his finger, gave it to Haman and said, "Keep the money and do with the people as you please." Armed with the king's authority, Haman wasted no time. On the 13th day of the 1st month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders. These decrees were issued in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. They were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. As copies of the edict were distributed throughout every province, The city of Susa was bewildered by this sudden turn of events. While the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in an uproar. A shadow had fallen over the kingdom, and the fate of an entire people now hung in the balance. As news of Haman's terrible decree spread throughout the kingdom, Mordecai was overcome with grief. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. In every province where the edict was read, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he refused them. Realizing something was terribly wrong, Esther sent Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther. He instructed Hathach to explain it to her and urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach returned to Esther and reported Mordecai's words. Esther's response, however, was not what Mordecai had hoped for. She instructed Hathach to relay this message back to Mordecai. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Mordecai received Esther's words, he sent back this reply: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" These words, particularly the phrase, "for such a time as this," would echo through history. They spoke to the heart of Esther's dilemma. Was she placed in this position of power, at this precise moment, for this very purpose? Mordecai's words stirred something in Esther. She sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." With these words, Esther accepted the mantle of responsibility. She would risk her life to save her people. The stage was now set for a dramatic confrontation that would determine the fate of all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Having made her decision, Esther set her plan in motion. She sent a message to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do." For 3 days and nights, the Jews of Susa fasted and prayed. In the palace, Esther and her attendants did the same. This period of fasting was not just about abstaining from food and drink. It was a time of intense spiritual preparation, a time to seek divine intervention in the face of impending doom. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. This was the moment of truth. Esther knew that approaching the king uninvited could mean death. The atmosphere was tense as everyone held their breath, waiting to see how the king would react. But when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." The king's curiosity was piqued. "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." And so the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "What is your petition? It will be given you." "And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." But Esther didn't reveal her true purpose just yet. Instead, she replied, Esther's voice with a hint of mystery, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Haman left the banquet in high spirits, delighted to be the only person Queen Esther had invited to the banquet with the king. But as he was leaving the palace, he saw Mordecai at the king's gate. And once again, Mordecai neither rose nor showed fear in his presence. Haman was filled with rage, but he restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and his wife Zeresh, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow." But then his tone changed, becoming bitter. "But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." Little did Haman know that his pride was leading him down a dangerous path, and that Esther's carefully laid plan was already in motion. That night, King Xerxes found himself unable to sleep. Tossing and turning, he decided to do something productive with his time. "Bring me the book of the Chronicles, the record of my reign," he commanded. As the king listened to the records being read, something caught his attention. It was an account of how Mordecai had exposed a plot by two of the king's officers, Bigthana and Teresh, to assassinate the king. King's voice. "What honor or recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. Just then, the king heard someone entering the outer court. It was Haman, who had arrived early to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected. "Who is in the court?" the king asked. When told it was Haman, the king said, "Bring him in." As Haman entered, the king posed a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman, thinking the king must be talking about honoring him, replied, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" "Excellent," the king replied. "Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Haman was stunned, but he had no choice. He took the robe and horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home, with his head covered in grief. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife warned him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. The time had come for Esther's second banquet. King Xerxes and Haman arrived, the air thick with anticipation. As they sat drinking wine, the king once again asked Esther, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for. With courage in her heart, she spoke, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life, this is my petition. And spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." The king was shocked. "Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing?" he demanded. Esther's next words fell like a thunderbolt. "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." Haman was paralyzed with fear before the king and queen. In his rage, King Xerxes stood up and went out into the palace garden. "Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. He fell on the couch where Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. As soon as the word left the king's mouth, attendants covered Haman's face, a sign that he was condemned to death. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king's decision was swift and final. Impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. In a twist of irony, Haman met his end on the very instrument he had prepared for Mordecai's destruction. His plot had not only failed, but had led to his own downfall. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. In a matter of hours, the tables had completely turned. Haman's evil plot had been exposed and defeated. Esther's courage had saved her people, and Mordecai was now elevated to a position of great honor and influence. But the story wasn't over yet. The decree to destroy the Jews still stood, sealed with the king's ring. Esther and Mordecai's work to save their people had only just begun. With Haman defeated, Esther and Mordecai turned their attention to the looming threat against the Jewish people. The original decree, sealed with the king's ring, could not be revoked. But there was still hope. Esther again approached the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. With the king's favor, Esther proposed a solution. "If it pleases the king, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces." The king agreed, and Mordecai was summoned. The king's scribes were called, and a new decree was written. This new edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The decree was issued in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with his ring. Couriers on fast horses rode out, carrying the edict to every corner of the empire. When the appointed day came, the Jews gathered in their cities throughout the provinces to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. In the city of Susa, the Jews struck down 500 men. They also killed Haman's 10 sons. However, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. When the king asked Esther if she had any further requests, she asked for one more day in Susa for the Jews to defend themselves and for Haman's sons to be impaled on poles. The king granted her wishes. After their victory, Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to establish among them the celebration of an annual festival. The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants, and all who joined them, should without fail observe these 2 days every year, in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days were called Purim, from the word pur, meaning lot, because Haman had cast the pur to determine the day to destroy the Jews. The festival of Purim was to be a time of feasting and joy, of sending presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. It would serve as a memorial, ensuring that the Jewish people would never forget how they were saved from annihilation. And so, through Esther's courage, Mordecai's wisdom, and divine providence, what was intended for evil was turned to good. The Jewish people were saved, and a new tradition was born that continues to this day. As the dust settled on the extraordinary events we've witnessed, Mordecai the Jew became second in rank to King Xerxes. He was preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Kindly like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel for more Bible stories.